Hello, world.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Educational Innovations 360 Degrees live chat. I'm David Johnson, the owner, principal of Transform Educational Consulting, and I'd like to thank Cassandra Williams. Cassandra Williams is the owner of Educational Innovations 360 Degrees. She is an influencer as well as the CEO of Educational Innovations 360 Degrees. Their purpose is to improve reading performance of students through one-to-one improved training of teachers. We have as our guest this evening, Mr. Amir Samandi. Amir, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, David. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm glad and excited to have you here as well. Our topic for today is making your classroom global. Amir Samandi is founder and executive director of Students of Service. SOS is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to providing San Antonio youth with experiential learning opportunities outside the classroom through community service and travel abroad. SOS has led more than 500 student travelers to over 15 countries and has provided more than 20,000 hours of community service to San Antonio. Amir was recently named one of San Antonio's 40 under 40 by the San Antonio Business Journal for his work with SOS. He was appointed to Texas's Expanded Learning Opportunities Council, which makes recommendations to the Texas legislature on out-of-school programs. And he was recently selected as a German Marshall Fund Memorial Fellow. That's the one that stands out to me. How did you become a German Marshall Fund Memorial Fellow?
Great question. I was nominated, and so I think there's a little bit of a nomination process from former fellows. And then I submitted my application, had several rounds of interviews, and now we've just kicked off the program. We were supposed to start, but then COVID hit, and we've moved everything sort of virtual, and we've already had a couple of kickoff exercises. But eventually, there's a requirement to travel to Europe, and specifically Germany, meet with members, elected office members, business leaders, civic leaders, etc. So hopefully I'll get to do that in 2022.
So is it that you would visit every year or every 2 years?
So it's the program is generally for that 1 year. But the idea is to build those transnational networks and international networks between, transatlantic specifically, between Europe and the US, and help strengthen our shared values and strengthen those alliances.
Well, Amir, you have a very, very interesting background. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
That's I think it starts with just who I am from an ethnic background. My father's from Iran originally, and my mom's Mexican American, and I grew up in Texas. So there was definitely a lot of mixing of cultures and international exposure, I think, at a young age, but also a recognition that Texas, and growing up particularly in the places that I didn't always have a lot of connection to the outside world. So I was always interested in travel. Ended up coming to St. Mary's in San Antonio for my bachelor's degree, and I did study abroad. I went to London, and that's when I had my epiphany. That's when I realized that I could dream so much bigger. And I came back basically on fire for international relations. I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in the State Department. I did that. Eventually found out it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, and I was looking to do something different. I had this idea to start this nonprofit where we might take young people abroad in order to help, change perspectives. And so I came back to San Antonio, worked for the military for a while, tried to start the nonprofit. It didn't really go anywhere, so I kind of put it on a shelf. And I was a professor, and one of my best friends taught me into being a full-time teacher. Dr. Lawrence Scott. Some of y'all might know him.
He's a full-time classroom teacher.
What's that?
A full-time classroom teacher.
Right. He said, you need to go K-12 where you can catch them young. And I was like, all right, I like this. and became a teacher, geography, 6th grade, and you know the rest from there.
A geography teacher, but you have expertise in things beyond geography, if I remember correctly.
I have my master's in international affairs from the Elliott School at George Washington University.
Right.
Worked in the State Department. I was one of 2 analysts working on the Iraq War, reporting to Colin Powell in his office, providing intel assessments. Did some things with that. Did some things with national security. Was an adjunct professor. I taught undergrad and grad courses in international studies, political science.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but it was that becoming that geography teacher that changed my life. So,
so would I be correct to say that in your heart you are an educator?
You would be correct to say that, David.
Mm-hmm. So then, what is your why? You know that question, I'm sure.
I do. Yeah, I think it's that experience as a geography teacher in a district in a particular school that was 87% economically disadvantaged. There was a magnet program there where I taught middle school, and there was a lower income student. She came to my desk. She saw a picture of the Eiffel Tower, and she said, "Sir, what's that?" It was just an ordinary day where kids were not wanting to pay attention to my geography class lesson. But it's often those ordinary days where things change quickly and crystallize. And that happened because she said, "What is that?" And I said, "That's the Eiffel Tower." She said, "Will you take us?" I said, "Let me show you on a map where it is." And I showed her where, France was. And she said, "Oh, I'll never go. That's too far." And it broke my heart to see a kid feel that way, that the world was too big to ever touch it, to ever experience it. Mm-hmm. And I said, don't think that way. No, it's absolutely possible. You can go as a, study abroad in college. I did that. And she's like, I can look at it. She's like, "I don't even know if I'm going to go to college." And I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? Like, teachers can take their students. It's possible, even middle school students. And the whole class was like, take us. And they're getting excited. And they started asking questions about Europe. And all of a sudden now my lesson was like out the window, but I didn't care because I was teaching something they were interested in. They were excited to learn about the world. And we had some great discussions. I said, "Well, listen, my wife and I, my wife just had our baby. He's still young. I'm going to go talk to her. Y'all talk to your parents and let's come back tomorrow and discuss." So you
got them all fired up then.
I did, right? I was that teacher. I'm always that teacher that's, pushing the envelope there. So
that's great.
In a good way.
Well, Amir, I got to tell you, we certainly appreciate teachers like you. If we didn't have renegade teachers, everything would just be smooth lake or smooth water. You need someone to make some waves so that the ships can move across those waters.
You can't have a reaction without an agent of change.
There you go.
So you got to have agents of change, and I'm trying to move education forward. I think just because we've always done things a certain way doesn't mean we have to. So great. I said to my wife, "This is what happened at school," and she said to me, "Honey, you need to take those kids."
So Amir, we're going to tell people how to do that with their own students in our topic today, making your classroom global. So we have 3 topics: experiential global learning, using the resources around you, building key relationships. So let's start off with experiential global learning, travel abroad with students.
That's a perfect segue, because when I came back to school, I asked the principal and I said, "Can I take these kids?" The principal said, "Absolutely not. District policies will not allow you to do this. Liability." We all get it, right? And I'm thinking most of you who are teachers or even principals are thinking the same thing. But I had a really cool principal who said, "Now there is a way, if you started your own nonprofit, for example, where you could do this." And all of a sudden, this idea that I had years ago, everything started coming together. And I said, "You know what? That's what I'm going to do." So we started a nonprofit of 501c3, Students of Service, SOS. And since then, it's been 7 years. We've taken 500 travelers abroad to 15 countries and over 20,000 hours of service, as was mentioned. So it can be done. And I'm not saying everybody has to go start their own nonprofit. But there's some really simple ways that you can do it. One,
well, first, let me ask you this. What is your definition of experiential and why global?
Sure. So both good questions. Experiential learning to me is learning by doing. Simple. And as the more you can break it down with simplicity, the better. I remember teaching the sixth graders, they were given like a 3-sentence definition of culture. And I said, okay, they were freaking out. Like, we got to write all this down. We got to memorize this. I said, listen, how you'll know the definition of culture is 3 words. I'm going to break it down for you simple. Way of life. That encapsulates culture. As you get older, we'll break that out into more and more complexity. But let's distill it. And even when you are, a master's student or teaching master's students, you got to be able to break things down and make them simple. And then you can expand on complexity. So that would be my definition of experiential learning. Learning by doing. And in terms of why global, I think the pandemic is a perfect example of why we have to think globally. That we can't delude ourselves to think that what happens in other places on the planet doesn't affect us. It does, deeply. Now, we're more connected than ever, and we can't just learn about the world through a screen. That can't be the only way that we learn about the world. Yes, we can do many things with our wonderful technology. I'm sure I'm talking to people all over the world right now who are listening to this, right? But it's even better if I can come and sit face to face with you and break bread and have a meal and smell the smells and taste the tastes and, experience the culture, experience the way of life.
So that would be experiencing global and acquiring global learning by traveling abroad.
Right. So in education, we talk about when we deliver a lesson, right? Activating prior knowledge. If you've never left the west side of San Antonio, there's not a lot of prior knowledge outside of that experience that you'll be able to activate.
Yeah.
So for us, I've taken kids to Beijing, China for their first time ever being on an airplane. They had never been on an airplane before.
Right.
I would say the percentage of kids who had never been on an airplane or never had a passport is somewhere around 30-40% of our students.
Yeah. Well, I had never flown in an airplane until I was 25 years old. Mm-hmm. Yeah, imagine that. So what's a virtual exchange?
So before we move on to virtual exchange, I want to hit on one point. There are plenty of ways to do travel abroad with students. Obviously, SOS, reach out to me. I can give you a list of ways to do it. Companies that are, for-profit, companies that are nonprofit. So I got some tips on some ways to do it the right way.
Okay.
And so, but yeah, since you asked about virtual exchange is essentially what we're doing here in terms of using the technology like Zoom or, other forms of Skype, other forms of online communication with video chat and audio. And what you do is it depends on how you set it up. But the way that we typically set it up is we find an international partner, determine, it's kind of like problem-based learning. We'll determine kind of some key issues that we want to resolve. It could be centered around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It could be centered around entrepreneurship. It could be centered around, you name it, serving your community. And then we break that down. We have discussions with the students from the other country. The hardest part oftentimes is finding a time that works with the time zone differences. And then from there, you build those relationships and you have the students, put them in breakout rooms and have them get to know each other a little bit. Then find a way to communicate through social media, if possible, depending on the country. Sometimes that's an issue with restrictions. But to keep those relationships strong.
Well, how do you manage the language differences?
Great question. So oftentimes the old joke, right? What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages?
Bilingual, 3 languages, trilingual, 1 language, American.
So unfortunately, there's a lot of truth to the joke. And what ends up happening is whoever we're working with wants to learn English. They want to practice English with native speakers. And they're already, most of the time, there are students who are at least learning it. And it could be China, it could be Germany, it could be Japan. They're learning English. And here, I think we've kind of lost the emphasis on pushing languages other than English. I would like to see more emphasis on global language, learning foreign languages. I think it's an asset, and it's going to be even more of a valuable asset in the future. So to answer your question, oftentimes they speak English, and we have a translator usually who is from their side who can speak fluently, or we'll bring in our own if we need to.
Well, that's great. So another aspect of experiential global learning would be hosting. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so we have this great relationship with, for example, our sister city in China, and that sister city to San Antonio is named Wuxi. So using our international relations office with our city government, we've been able to facilitate these relationships, both visiting. We've gone and taken students to China, to Wuxi. We've also done virtual exchange with Wuxi. And then for 4 years in a row, prior to the pandemic, we hosted an average of about 30 Chinese students in San Antonio homes. So they had San Antonio food. They met San Antonio mamas and San Antonio daddies and San Antonio, brothers and sisters. They learned about the Alamo, the missions, and of course, what I've learned, the most unifying thing in San Antonio, the Spurs. They were so excited about the San Antonio Spurs. We would take them to the AT&T Center. That's a big thing. NBA is really big in China, as some of y'all know. And so, that was a big highlight for them.
Are there some specific legal concerns or regulatory concerns that you must address?
Yeah, definitely. So that's the advantage of being a nonprofit, right? That's why I went that route for what I was trying to do, because my vision was bigger than just maybe just one little trip to the Eiffel Tower, which in and of itself sounds crazy, but I will say we did do it, and I've got pictures here to prove it. It's on the website. This is London, but that same trip we went to Eiffel Tower, I could show you. But you definitely want to know what you're getting into. Like, for example, to do the hosting, I would say you want to partner with an organization, which I'm going to talk about later. But find organizations to partner with that can handle the liabilities, so that you, the school, or you, the teacher, don't necessarily have to take all that on.
That's great. Well, okay, let's move on to the next topic: using the resources around you.
Yeah, I mean, essentially everything that we've been able to do with SOS has been through just using the resources around us. But also, as a classroom teacher, even if you don't have an SOS where you live, which unless you live in San Antonio is the case, you've got things like Model United Nations, and there are Model United Nations groups, resources online, kits to get started. If you don't have one, you can make your own. You could even make, like in college, we had a model OAS, Organization of American States, or you can make, other regional intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs. So it doesn't have to be as big as the UN. There's also, a competition called Academic World Quest, which uses resources from foreign affairs and basically pulls together information that is of global nature that is essentially like a trivia game, but the kids have to study the material in order to compete.
Wow, that sounds exciting. Could you give us an example of how you've used that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was a classroom teacher, which I was in the classroom for about almost 8 years, teaching geography, both 6th grade and 9th grade. And so I became the coach for the World Quest team. And every city that has a World Affairs Council, I believe they all participate. If not, you may want to press your World Affairs Council on this, but it's essentially a citywide tournament that takes place in like February, and students from schools all over the city participate, and it's kind of like a quiz bowl. So they sit at a table and they're given questions on the projector, and then they have to put their answers down quietly so the other groups don't hear them, and then submit them. And then at the end, they total the scores, and the winner gets a trip to nationals in DC.
That sounds great. Wow, that's impressive. Always impressive. How do Rotary Clubs fit into making one's classroom global?
Well, and one more thing on the World Quest is I wanted to mention this. we would practice twice a week after school. So we would go through the Great Decisions books that talk about these different foreign policy challenges, and essentially kind of learn about, what's going on in Russia, for example, what's going on in Colombia, what's happening in Haiti, what's happening in, Korea, and get students to kind of even find these places on a map, A, B, start to have an understanding of the history. I think as Americans, we forget that our history is short, and most other cultures around the world have a very long view of history. So those practices, whether you win or lose, those practices are giving students exposure and experiential learning.
Great. Great.
So Rotary Clubs, you asked.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So Rotary Clubs are really special because it is a global network. So a Rotary Club in Kansas City is going to have connections with Rotary Clubs in, I don't know, Perth, Australia, right? There are going to be connections that are global through those Rotary Clubs. You'll be able to bring in, for example, guest speakers from the Rotary Club who might be able to tell you about their travels to Burkina Faso or an experience they had in Mongolia. And oftentimes they'll have, slides, like a slide deck that can come and be a guest speaker, right? And just give the kids a change of pace. Let them see there's a real person who's actually been there and came back and, had great stories to tell. Even I've used the Peace Corps. So the Peace Corps has a program where you come home and you're required to present to the community. So find out if there are any Peace Corps groups in your community and leverage them to come in and give presentations. So they have to do it. They're looking for classes to do it in.
Now, Amir, I was a member of a Rotary Club some years ago, and I recall that we also did some fundraising. And I wonder if you use the Rotary Clubs for funding, or in general, how do you fund the organization itself?
Great question. We have not yet worked with Rotary on fundraising, but I've got some things in the works currently. Talking to some really interesting and wonderful people over there, and we're more to follow on that. But I will say that yeah, for SOS, fundraising is a challenge. You're constantly fundraising. Kids want to go on the trips. They don't have the money. We help them fundraise. Give them tools like selling coffee fundraisers, candy fundraisers, you name it. Make sure they have skin in the game. But also donors. I've had wonderful individual donors like tonight. Anyone watching, I've said this before and it's come true. So if you want to sponsor a low-income kid, reach out to me and we can help make it happen. I said that at a speech once I was giving in Corpus Christi, and a very kind gentleman walked up to me afterwards and said, I want to give you $3,000 to help a student go. And she went, and it changed her life. And she's at Texas Tech University right now. So shout out to Abby. So, it just takes telling your story. It takes bringing your community together and like really getting everybody on board with the mission. And the why is because it changes a kid's life. It's transformational, and it shrinks the amount of time that it takes to get the kid on the right trajectory.
Mm-hmm. That seems to roll right into our next topic, building key relationships.
Yes, sir. So, I'm not an archer, but I always think of it this way. If you were an archer and you're pulling back your arrow and on your bow, right? And you got the target downrange, you say 100 yards, and somebody comes and just moves your hand, even a fraction of an inch, that's going to change the entire trajectory of that arrow, right? And that's how I view what we're doing with kids. If we can catch young people, and I know this from personal experience, the right people coming at the right time when you're young can really put you on a great path. And I think that's the key with your students. Whether you take them to the Eiffel Tower or not, give them your all. Give them everything you've got in the classroom. And I know the vast majority of teachers do. So these kind of opportunities, even bringing in the Peace Corps volunteer to speak, that changed kids' lives. I know I got notes from my students who said, wow, I didn't even know this was a thing I could do. I didn't know this was a job, right? And so it starts there. Make sure your kids know that you care, because they're not going to learn from you if they don't know you care, right?
Mm-hmm.
Relationships are the key.
Now, Amir, you spoke a lot about the transformational effect these trips have on students and the various experiential learning events have on students. Tell us how that affects their leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of times parents will tell me when their student comes back from one of our experiences. I've gotten emails and texts from parents, and they might be watching tonight. They said, "Wow, I sent you with a middle schooler, and she came back a high schooler. My kid is a completely different kid. Oh my gosh, they're public speaking. They're speaking publicly now. They didn't used to do that, or they're taking care of their room and waking up on time for school." And the reason is when we're on our trips, we expect the students to, they've got a roommate for the first time, maybe. They're budgeting on their own for the first time. Being away from home forces you to appreciate everything that your parents do for you because you now have to do for yourself. You need to be on the bus at 6:30 a.m. because we are going to visit the Louvre, or we are going to the Great Wall of China. Get on the bus, don't be late, or all the group is going to say, "You held us up. We missed the Great Wall because of you," right? So the students kind of pressure each other to step up and rise. And you see natural leaders emerge in the group, but you also see that there's an element of leading through being a good teammate, right? Leading in whatever way it might be. It might be that maybe there's a kid who can lead and get 20 students inspired and fired up to do the right thing or to do something awesome. But there might be the ones that I notice is the one who looks at the kid who's maybe like looking a little lost or falling behind. And that one student will devote themselves to helping that other student pretty much the whole trip until they've both leveled up at the end.
Oh, I'm so happy about that. Let's talk about administration and building relationships with school and district administration.
Yeah, that can be a challenge, I think, because rightfully so, administrators, they're focused on, hey, how are our test scores looking? How is attendance? How's the behavior issue? They've got so many things on their plate, and this can add a level of stress. But what I found from those administrators who see the bigger picture is it actually really helps your community. It helps your school environment, your school culture to have these students because they do come back as leaders, which then spills over into the student body, and you see a completely different demeanor from your student body. And so I think getting administrators on board and making sure they're with you and that you're answering their questions on safety, liability, if you're going to do travel, that's a must. And having the parents backing you up as well. I mean, if you have the parents buy in like I do for what we do with SOS, the administration listens to that. They go, "Wow, this does work. This matters."
This is great, Amir. So if we were to boil this down into one takeaway, what would it be?
If you're going to have one takeaway tonight, it's that any teacher who wants to bring a global element to their classroom can do so. It's up to you how much you want to bring in. But there are enough resources out there that you can do it. There's a website called 𝐴mpático, where you can set up virtual exchanges, for example. There are travel companies. There's, talk to me. I'll give you a ton of tips. But if you want to do this, you can.
And so what's your call to action?
My call to action is support groups like SOS, like your Rotary, like your Model UNs, like give it a try. Try one thing to globalize your classroom just a little. We have even programs where, like with SOS, where we help English language learners, right, and practice English. There's so much you could do. Just take action where you can with what you've got.
Okay. And if people wanted to contact you for further information, tell us how.
Everything is right there in the bottom of the slide. So you got our website. I've got my Twitter handle for SOS, but also for me personally, and the Facebook and the Instagram, LinkedIn. And then, of course, my email is just amir@sossanantonio.org. I'm easy to find. Google me. You'll find me.
Amir Samandi is founder and executive director of Students of Service. I am David Johnson. I'm the owner principal of Transform Ed Consulting. And again, we'd like to thank Cassandra Williams. She's the brainchild of Educational Innovations 360 Degrees. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Have a great evening.
Thank you.